He was just my therapist. Nothing more. That's what I told myself every single time I walked into his office. But then came the silence that lingered too long, the gaze that held mine just a second too deep, and the moment I realized this wasn't just about healing anymore. This was about something neither of us were ready to admit, until we couldn't deny it any longer. The hallway leading to the consultation room was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt thick like it had weight. Owen Clark stepped in with hesitant footsteps, his shoulders slightly hunched, his gaze flickering around the modest furnishings of the waiting room. He looked like someone who didn't want to be seen, even though he had willingly walked into this space. 22 and still unsure of his place in the world, he had come here not out of confidence, but out of desperation. Panic attacks had begun to disrupt even the most mundane parts of his life, and someone, he couldn't remember who, had recommended Dr. Nathan Hale. Nathan sat in his chair with the calmness of someone who had mastered the art of silence. He was in his late 30s, tall and composed, with a voice that didn't need to be raised to command attention. His office didn't resemble a cold, clinical environment. It felt warm, curated to soothe rather than intimidate. A bookshelf lined one wall, a muted rug covered the wooden floor, and soft afternoon light spilled in through half-closed blinds. Owen settled into the chair opposite, shifting uncomfortably, his hands twisting together in his lap. He didn't speak right away, and neither did Nathan. There was no rush. That was the first thing Owen noticed, how unhurried everything felt. No pressure to fill the silence. Just space. Space to breathe, or try to. When Nathan finally did speak, it was only to invite Owen to talk if and when he felt ready. His tone was neutral, unintrusive, but there was something in his gaze, an attentiveness that didn't feel manufactured. Owen began with small things. Generalized phrases about stress, about sleepless nights, and sudden heartbeats in crowded rooms. He avoided specifics, but Nathan didn't push. He simply nodded, occasionally jotting down a note, his focus never wavering. Over the course of several sessions, the conversation began to shift. Owen started speaking more freely, gradually peeling back the layers he usually hid behind. The awkward boy who had barely made eye contact during their first meeting began sitting a little straighter, his voice less tentative. But Nathan noticed other things too. Pauses that lingered a fraction too long, a glance that didn't break when it probably should have, a question asked not just with curiosity, but with something unspoken wrapped inside it. For Nathan, these sessions became increasingly complex. He had always maintained strict boundaries in his practice, clear, professional, unbending. But there was something different about Owen, something that stayed with him long after the hour ended. It wasn't attraction in the immediate, physical sense, at least not at first. It was more subtle, a recognition, maybe, or a vulnerability that mirrored something Nathan had long buried. One afternoon, after a particularly honest session in which Owen spoke about a moment of emotional collapse on a subway platform, Nathan felt a pang of something that wasn't supposed to exist within the confines of his work. Not pity, but connection. It wasn't about the story itself. It was the way Owen had told it, the quiet in his voice, the tremble in his hand, and the way his eyes had searched Nathan's face for any trace of judgment. Nathan had offered a nod, a soft comment about resilience, but internally he was rattled. Not because Owen had shared something difficult. He'd heard many such stories over the years, but because he had wanted to reach across the space between them. To say something not as a doctor, but as a person, as a man. From that moment, the sessions took on a different weight. Owen began to open up more rapidly, as though sensing the shift. The room itself seemed to change, more charged somehow. There were longer silences, but they didn't feel empty. They were heavy with everything neither of them said. One day, Owen mentioned in passing that he sometimes felt safer in this room than anywhere else in his life. He said it casually, as though it were a compliment to the decor. But Nathan felt the words lodge somewhere deeper. He smiled politely, but his chest tightened. He started noticing more, how Owen's fingers lingered on the armrest when he spoke about something painful, or how his gaze would rest just a second too long when they made eye contact. Nathan told himself it was projection, Transference. Textbook. But that explanation stopped satisfying him after a while. At night, long after the sessions ended, Nathan found himself staring at his ceiling, replaying the way Owen had looked at him that day. There was no crossing of lines, no violation of ethics, but something was happening, something neither of them acknowledged. And Nathan, a man who prided himself on restraint, began to feel the first cracks in his carefully maintained resolve. The sessions continued, unfolding slowly like pages in a novel that neither of them could put down. Owen became more confident in the way he carried himself, no longer shrinking into his seat as he once had. His voice, once barely above a whisper, now carried weight, even when he spoke about fear. Each week, he brought more of himself into the room, more truth, more vulnerability, more questions he wasn't sure how to ask out loud. Nathan noticed everything. He noticed how Owen began wearing colors again, muted blues, soft greens instead of the safe blacks and grays. He noticed when Owen started arriving a few minutes early, waiting quietly in the hallway. And most of all, he noticed the way the silence between them had started to feel charged. What used to be comforting had become something else entirely. Each glance, each slight shift of posture, carried more meaning than it should have. Nathan tried to focus on the words, the symptoms, the progress. But there was something lingering in the space between them, unspoken but undeniably real. It was never physical, not even slightly inappropriate by standard measures, but the boundary had begun to blur in a way that was more dangerous than any obvious gesture. Owen, for his part, didn't seem aware of the shift in the same way Nathan was. Or maybe he was, but didn't have a language for it. He still brought up the occasional panic attack, still spoke about his strained relationship with his father, about sleepless nights and unfinished projects. But then he would pause mid-sentence, searching Nathan's face for something. Not guidance, not validation, something deeper. Connection. The clinic itself became a place suspended in time. Outside, the world went on. Rain came and went, people moved through their routines. But inside Nathan's office, time slowed. The late afternoon sun filtering through the blinds cast long, golden streaks on the floor, and the air felt heavier with each session. Nathan began to question himself. He replayed every word, every moment of eye contact, every laugh Owen allowed to escape when the mood lightened. He reminded himself of the code he had always followed: do no harm, maintain boundaries, protect the space. But even the reminder began to lose its power. He found himself wondering about Owen's life beyond the sessions. Did he cook for himself? Did he have friends who really knew him? Did he ever look at someone and feel what Nathan had started to feel? Something unnameable, dangerous, and impossible to ignore? After one particularly intense session, Nathan sat alone in his office for a long time. Owen had just left, having shared something about a recurring dream that left him feeling exposed. It wasn't the content of the dream that haunted Nathan. It was the way Owen had spoken, the way his eyes had held his for just a second too long, like he wanted to say something but stopped himself. That night, Nathan couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft ticking of the clock, his mind circling around the same impossible thought. This cannot continue. The next morning, he drafted a letter of termination for Owen's file. It was standard, kind, supportive, ethical. He would explain that their work together had reached a natural conclusion. He would recommend another therapist. It was the right thing to do, but he didn't send it. Not yet. A week later, during their next session, Nathan could barely concentrate. Owen spoke, but Nathan's thoughts were elsewhere. He knew it was wrong. He knew that whatever this was, it had already crossed an invisible line. Even if nothing had happened, something had changed, and it couldn't be undone. As the session neared its end, Nathan looked at Owen and said what he had rehearsed a dozen times in his mind. His tone remained steady, professional, even as his heart threatened to betray him. He told Owen that he believed their time together had been valuable, but that it might be best to conclude their therapeutic relationship. He recommended a colleague, said it with a softness that almost masked the finality of it. Owen didn't respond at first. He sat very still, his expression unreadable. When he finally nodded, it was slow, uncertain, but without protest. He thanked Nathan for the help, for the sessions, for the space. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed something else: confusion, sadness, maybe even loss. After Owen left that day, Nathan stood by the window, watching the sun slip behind the rooftops. He had done the right thing. He knew that, but the ache in his chest told another story. In ending the sessions, he had closed the door he wasn't sure he wanted shut. Several weeks passed in silence, each day stretching like a thin thread pulled too tight. Nathan tried to focus on other patients, on paperwork, on ordinary tasks that should have grounded him. But a part of his mind always returned to that final session, to the moment Owen had quietly gathered his things and walked away without resistance. The room felt different now, colder somehow, even though nothing had changed in its decor. Nathan told himself he had made the right choice. He reminded himself that ethical boundaries were not suggestions, they were safeguards. Still, he found himself wondering what Owen was thinking, whether he had found a new therapist, whether he had moved on. The questions lingered, unanswered, and Nathan made no attempt to pursue them. Then, one evening, as he sat alone on his living room couch with a book he hadn't actually opened, his phone lit up. A message from a number no longer saved in his contacts. The words were brief but unmistakable. "I've been thinking about our last conversation. Would you ever consider meeting outside the office just to talk?" Nathan stared at the screen for a long time. His immediate instinct was to ignore it, to protect both of them from whatever consequences might follow. But something deep inside him resisted. This wasn't a patient reaching out for treatment. This was someone who had meant something more, someone whose absence had left a space that no professional duty could fill. He typed and deleted a dozen responses before finally sending the simplest one. "Maybe. Tell me when and where." Owen replied almost immediately. A quiet coffee shop tucked in the edge of downtown. Not far from the clinic, but far enough to feel separate. He suggested meeting the next afternoon. Nathan agreed, then placed his phone face down, as if that could somehow stop the current already pulling him forward. The next day, Nathan arrived early. He chose a corner table, facing the window, hands wrapped tightly around a cup of black coffee he barely touched. The place was nearly empty, the sound of the espresso machine humming softly in the background. Outside, the weather had turned cold, the sky a blanket of gray. When Owen walked in, Nathan's chest tightened. The younger man looked different, older somehow, though only a few weeks had passed. There was a new stillness to him, a calmness that seemed both earned and fragile. He spotted Nathan and walked over without hesitation. They greeted each other quietly, avoiding direct eye contact for a moment too long. No handshakes, no smiles. Just silence, and then slow conversation. At first, it was light. How things had been. How Owen had started seeing another therapist, though only once so far. Nathan nodded, listening carefully, forcing himself not to analyze every word. But then the conversation shifted. It wasn't planned. It just happened. Owen spoke about missing the space they'd created together. Not the therapy, not the structure, but him. Nathan didn't interrupt. He let the words land, one by one, in the space between them. He could feel something uncoiling inside his chest, a tension he hadn't known he was holding. Eventually, the words grew slower, less guarded. Owen admitted that he hadn't sent the message on impulse. He had thought about it for days, telling himself not to reach out. But he couldn't let it go. Not entirely. There was a pause after that. One of those long, quiet moments that said more than any sentence could. Nathan looked at Owen, then really looked. And he saw the same weight in his eyes that he had seen that day in the clinic. The vulnerability, the questions, the hope. Without fully realizing what he was doing, he reached across the table, his fingers brushing lightly against Owen's. The contact was fleeting, hesitant, but it wasn't accidental. Owen didn't pull away. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a decision. But it was a shift, a subtle acknowledgement of something real between them, no longer cloaked in the language of therapy or the safety of professionalism. Nathan eventually drew his hand back, his voice quiet when he finally spoke again. He said they had to be careful, that this wasn't simple, that he didn't have the answers yet. Owen nodded, understanding more in the tone than the words. They sat in that cafe for a while longer, not making plans, not defining anything, just being. And when they parted ways outside, with a lingering glance and a half-formed smile, it was clear that the distance between them had changed. Not erased, but softened. This wasn't a conclusion. It was a beginning. The evening felt colder than expected, and Nathan found himself adjusting the thermostat out of habit rather than discomfort. His apartment, usually a place of quiet reflection, now held a strange weight. He paced for a while, rearranged a few books on the shelf, then lit a single lamp in the living room, letting its soft amber glow spill across the hardwood floor. It wasn't nerves, at least not exactly. It was something more complex. Anticipation layered with restraint, awareness shadowed by uncertainty. He hadn't seen Owen since the cafe meeting. They hadn't exchanged many messages since then either. But earlier that afternoon, a short text had arrived. "I'm nearby. Would it be all right to stop by?" Nathan had paused before responding. The question carried more than just casual meaning. Letting Owen into his home would shift something, make it real. Still, he answered yes. Now, with every passing minute, the decision echoed louder. When a knock finally came, it was gentle, almost tentative. Nathan opened the door to find Owen standing there, hands in his pockets, his expression somewhere between calm and cautious. They exchanged a nod, no words, and Owen stepped inside. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the heater. Owen looked around as though trying to take it all in at once, as if the space might reveal something about the man who had, until recently, only existed behind a desk and in controlled environments. Nathan offered a seat with a subtle gesture. Owen accepted. They sat across from each other at first, not speaking. The silence wasn't awkward. It was full of meaning, full of things neither knew how to phrase. The energy in the room was not loud, not electric, but thick and slow-moving, like fog rolling in from the sea. Every breath felt louder than it should, every small movement magnified. Nathan watched Owen carefully. There was a shift in him, not dramatic but noticeable. He seemed older, more grounded, yet the openness in his face remained. The way his eyes moved around the room, then slowly landed back on Nathan, said everything. Time moved strangely after that. At one point, Owen stood and approached a nearby bookshelf, letting his fingers trail along the spines of worn paperbacks. Nathan joined him there, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel the warmth that radiated from his presence. There were no words, only stillness. And then, slowly, something changed. Owen turned slightly, his shoulder brushing Nathan's. The contact was brief but undeniable. Nathan didn't step away. Instead, he let it settle, let the closeness remain. He had spent weeks wrestling with boundaries, with responsibility, with what was acceptable. But in that quiet moment, all of it felt suspended. They moved to the couch without coordination, as if guided by the same unspoken cue. The space between them was small, their knees nearly touching. Owen sat with his hands folded in his lap, but the tension in his posture had softened. Nathan exhaled slowly, leaning back just slightly, trying to find a steady rhythm to his breath. When Owen finally looked at him, really looked, it was like stepping into a memory. There was something familiar in the way their eyes locked, something that had existed in the therapy room but had never been allowed to breathe. Now it was no longer restrained. Without speaking, Owen reached out, his fingers brushing against Nathan's. The contact was feather-light, barely there, yet it felt like it lit the air between them. Nathan didn't move. He allowed the touch, allowed the sensation of connection to seep in, quiet and undeniable. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't anything dramatic. It was stillness and skin, the intimacy of proximity, the aching realization that something long denied was now simply present. Nathan turned his hand slightly, letting their palms meet, not grasping, just aligning. His heart beat steadily, too fast, too loud, but his face remained calm. Owen looked down at their hands, then back up, and in his expression was something raw. Not desire, not fear, but truth. There was no rush to define what this was. No declarations. No decisions made, just a shared awareness that something between them had taken root long before either had acknowledged it. And now it had begun to bloom, quietly, in the safety of lamplight and silence. Eventually, Nathan shifted, leaning just enough for their shoulders to touch. They stayed that way for a long time, unmoving, their breathing synced without effort. The moment wasn't perfect or planned, but it was real. Outside, the city continued on. Inside, two people sat beside each other, hands barely joined, hearts quietly colliding in the stillness of a night that had changed everything. The night after Owen left, Nathan remained seated on the same couch, the quiet hum of the city leaking through the closed windows. He hadn't moved for what felt like hours. The memory of their closeness, the silent connection they had shared, lingered in the space like the fading warmth of sunlight after dusk. He knew something irreversible had occurred, not loud or scandalous, but something that would change the rhythm of his life. In the days that followed, they did not speak, not out of fear, but out of the weight of what had happened. Sometimes silence speaks the truth better than words ever could. Nathan found himself reliving the stillness, the steady breathing they had shared, the way Owen's fingers had brushed against his with nothing more than quiet intention. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced, intimate without being physical, honest without being spoken. He wondered what Owen was feeling, whether he regretted the moment, or if he, too, was caught in the same emotional drift, uncertain of what to do next but unwilling to let go. Then, on a quiet Sunday morning, a message arrived. Short, careful, not rushed. "I'd like to see you again." Not to talk, just to be. Nathan stared at the words for a long time. There was nothing demanding about the message. No expectation, just a request to exist beside one another again, to share space where neither had to explain what they were feeling. When Owen arrived that afternoon, everything was more grounded. There were no lingering questions in his expression, only his softness. Nathan opened the door and let him in without ceremony. There were no greetings, no awkward tension, just a kind of quiet relief. They didn't sit across from one another this time. Instead, they settled on the couch, side by side, as if that was where they had always belonged. The silence returned, but it was lighter now, easier. There was no pressure to define what had changed between them, and yet something had. Nathan reached for Owen's hand, and this time, the contact was certain. Their fingers wove together gently, not in passion, but in quiet promise. This wasn't infatuation, nor was it an attempt to escape loneliness. It was two people who had walked through layers of caution, distance, and resistance, and who had found something quiet but true on the other side. They spoke, eventually, but not about what they were. They talked about music, childhood memories, favorite seasons. They shared stories that didn't need to serve any purpose but to be heard. With each word, Nathan felt something loosen inside him, a quiet acceptance that what was happening wasn't wrong. It was fragile, yes. It needed care, but it wasn't something to fear. Owen, too, seemed more at ease. He laughed, really laughed, for the first time Nathan had ever seen. Not the polite laugh of a patient trying to impress, but something natural and unfiltered. And in that sound, Nathan heard a kind of freedom, a release that made him realize how much both of them had held in for so long. They didn't speak of futures, nor made plans. They didn't rush to label what had formed between them. But when Owen stood to leave, he paused at the door. Nathan stood behind him, uncertain whether to reach for him or let him go. Owen turned, met his eyes, and smiled, a soft, real smile that held no pressure. It said enough. Nathan closed the door gently after Owen stepped out, then leaned his forehead against the wood, exhaling a long-held breath. There was no longer the ache of uncertainty. There was still complexity, still caution, but now there was also clarity. In the days that followed, they continued to see each other, not in secret, not with urgency, but with intention. They moved slowly, deliberately, letting each encounter build trust rather than expectation. Nathan was careful. He knew the consequences of crossing lines in his profession, but their connection had stepped outside the bounds of therapy long ago. What remained now was something tender and real, As autumn turned into early winter, their meetings became part of a quiet rhythm. Walks through the park, coffee on rainy afternoons, long moments of silence that no longer needed to be filled. One evening, they sat on Nathan's balcony, wrapped in a shared blanket, watching the wind push clouds across the sky. Owen leaned his head against Nathan's shoulder, not needing to say a word. And Nathan, for the first time in years, felt peace. Not because he had found certainty, but because he had stopped fighting what felt true. What had started as a forbidden glance across a room had become something delicate and enduring. This wasn't a love story marked by grand declarations or dramatic turns. It was something quieter, the kind of story built on trust, timing, and the courage to follow what the heart already knew. And for Nathan and Owen, that was enough.